Have you ever just stopped and thought about the absolute miracle that's happening inside your head at this very moment? I mean, you're taking in sounds or maybe symbols on a screen and turning them into these incredibly complex ideas, effortlessly. It's something we do all the time, but it's also one of the biggest mysteries out there. So, how in the world does this 3-pound organ between our ears actually produce and understand language? Well, to figure that out, we've got to take a look under the hood at the brain's amazing linguistic machinery. So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle the big, foundational puzzle of where language even lives in the brain. Then, we'll hop in a time machine and head back to the 19th century to see how scientists first started mapping out the key locations. After that, we'll follow the journey of a single thought, see how the brain's two halves work as a team, and finally, we'll get into the incredible adaptive power of the brain's plasticity. It's going to be a fun ride.
All right, first things first, we have to start with the big picture. Before anyone could even think about pointing to a language spot in the brain, they had to wrestle with an even more basic question. Is language some kind of unique built-in human instinct, or is it just a really, really clever trick our big brains figured out how to do?
And that question right there, where is language, is what's been driving neuroscientists and linguists crazy for centuries. The early researchers, they kind of imagined this single language box just tucked away in a corner of the brain somewhere. But today, we're thinking it's more like a super complex web with connections stretching all across the brain. And as you're about to see, the truth is a fascinating mix of both ideas.
This whole debate really boils down to two main camps. On one side, you've got the nativists. They argue that language is special, that we're literally born with a unique genetic blueprint for it, kind of like having an app pre-installed on your phone at birth. Then you have the cognitivists. They see our brains more like powerful general-purpose computers. They'd say our hardware isn't all that different from other intelligent animals. We've just figured out how to run this unbelievably complex language software on it. So, to even start looking for language, we need a basic map of the territory. Think of your brain as having 4 big neighborhoods, or lobes. Now, they all have a ton of different jobs, but for our little tour, let's focus on 2. You've got the frontal lobe, right up front, which helps with planning our speech. And then there's the temporal lobe, on the side, which is a major hub for understanding what we hear. But here's the absolute key takeaway. Language isn't just in one spot. Nope, it's a massive team effort involving all of these regions working together. Okay, so we've got the general lay of the land. Now, let's zoom in and find the specific street addresses for language. And ironically, the very first maps of the brain's language centers weren't created by studying healthy brains at all. They were drawn by looking very, very closely at what happens when parts of the brain get damaged. So let's go back to the 1800s. 2 absolute pioneers, Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke, had a huge breakthrough. By studying patients who had very specific and unusual problems with language, they managed to pinpoint 2 critical language zones, both in the left half of the brain. You've got Broca's area, which sits more towards the front, and Wernicke's area, further back, closer to the ear. These 2 spots became the first major landmarks on our linguistic map of the brain. Now, when these areas are damaged, it causes a condition called aphasia. And the difference between the two is just striking. Look at the left column here. Damage to Broca's area messes with production. The person's speech becomes slow, really effortful, like they're struggling to get each word out. But, and this is key, they can usually still understand what other people are saying pretty well. Now look at the right. Damage to Wernicke's area is the complete opposite. It hits comprehension. The person can speak fluently, with perfect grammar, but the words are just meaningless. It's often called a word salad. They're producing language, but they can't make sense of it anymore. Okay, so these early studies were absolutely huge. They laid the groundwork for everything that came next. But they weren't perfect. Scientists started realizing that, a damaged brain doesn't always give you a perfect blueprint for a healthy one. They found patients whose symptoms didn't fit neatly into these boxes, which suggested that the brain's wiring is way more complex and maybe even more individualized than they first thought.
Which brings us to our next big question. How do all these different pieces actually work together? We found the key players on the team, Broca's and Wernicke's areas, but how do they pass the ball back and forth to turn a sound that we hear into a spoken reply?
Well, a classic way to understand this is something called the Wernicke-Geschwind model. Now, modern science has definitely added more bells and whistles, but this model gives us a fantastic basic roadmap of the language pathway. It really highlights this critical bundle of nerve fibers called the arcuate fasciculus. You can think of it as a superhighway that directly connects Wernicke's comprehension center to Broca's production center. So let's just walk through it real quick. Imagine someone asks you a question. That sound first hits your primary auditory cortex. From there, the signal zips over to Wernicke's area, which figures out the meaning. Then Wernicke's area comes up with a reply and sends that plan rocketing across that superhighway, the arcuate fasciculus, over to Broca's area. Broca's area then translates that plan into a detailed set of instructions for your mouth, which it sends to the primary motor cortex. And finally, the motor cortex tells your mouth, tongue, and voice box exactly what to do to speak the answer. It's this beautiful high-speed relay race happening in a fraction of a second.
All right, so far we've been really focused on the left side of the brain. But now it's time to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. This whole division of labor between the two halves of our brain.
This whole phenomenon has a name. It's called lateralization. The easiest way to think about it is like having two expert specialists working together. The two hemispheres of your brain look pretty similar, but they actually specialize in different kinds of tasks. And for the vast majority of people, when it comes to the heavy lifting of language, all the complex, analytical work, the left hemisphere is the dedicated go-to expert.
So how can we be so sure about this? Well, scientists have some seriously clever ways to test it. In what's called a WADA test, they can temporarily put one half of the brain to sleep, and when they quiet down the left side, most people suddenly can't speak. Or there are dichotic listening tests where you hear different words in each ear at the same time. Most people will say they heard the word that went into their right ear because that signal goes straight to the dominant left hemisphere. And maybe the most famous evidence comes from split-brain patients. Their two hemispheres are disconnected. They can name an object they see with their right eye, which reports to the left brain, but not one they see with their left. It's wild.
But, and this is where things get really cool, the brain is not a one-size-fits-all organ. For over 99% of right-handed people, language is parked firmly on the left. But for left-handers, oh, the map gets completely scrambled. A whopping 70% of lefties actually process language primarily in their right hemisphere. Another 15% use both sides about equally, and only a tiny 15% follow that typical left side pattern. Isn't that amazing? This incredible variability we see in left-handers leads us perfectly into our final and maybe the most mind-blowing topic of all: the brain's incredible ability to change and adapt, especially when we're very young.
This all ties into something called the critical period hypothesis. The basic idea is that for the first few years of your life, your brain is like wet cement when it comes to language. It's incredibly flexible, malleable, a state we call plasticity. During this special window of time, the brain is just primed to soak up language like a sponge. But as we get older, that cement starts to harden, and those language functions get more and more locked into place.
The implications of this are just astounding. For example, if a very young child, say before the age of 5, suffers a serious injury to their left hemisphere, the language hemisphere, the brain can pull off a truly remarkable feat of self-repair. Language can actually move out of the damaged left side and set up shop in the undamaged right hemisphere, completely preserving this essential human ability. It just shows you how flexible and resilient our neural wiring can be.
And so, all of this leaves us with one last, huge, fascinating question that researchers are still trying to figure out today. Is there just one single critical period for language as a whole? Or could there be a whole series of smaller, overlapping windows? Maybe one for learning a perfect native-like accent, another for mastering complex grammar, and yet another for achieving overall fluency. It seems the user's guide to our own brains is definitely still a work in progress.